Hi, I'm Richard Howe. Welcome to today's virtual tour. It's part of a three-part series on Civil War Lowell. Today's episode is Lords of the Loom. We'll be talking about the conflict between the economic interest the city of Lowell had in the free flow of cotton from the American South and the impulse towards abolitionism that was felt by many of the residents in the city. Unlike our regular Lowell walking tours, we're not bound by the geography of downtown Lowell with these virtual tours. So today it's more of a chronological story that touches Lowell in many ways, and also the broader story of how the Civil War came to the United States. Francis Cabot Lowell was born in Newburyport in 1775, just a couple of weeks after the opening battles of the American Revolution at Lexington and Concord. His father was a lawyer and then a judge, so he came from a wealthy family. As a young man, he became a merchant in Boston, and he made quite a bit of money trading with the Far East. Then in the second decade of the 19th century, in the 1810s, he became interested in domestic textile production. What was the catalyst for his interest was a journey he took to England. Francis was in poor health for most of his life, and so he went to England for 2 years along with his family, hoping that the change in climate would be beneficial to his health. I don't know that that helped him a lot physically, but it did give Francis an opportunity to see the emerging textile industry in England. The story of what he did is fairly well known. He memorized the design of the different machinery in the English textile mills, and he smuggled that knowledge back to the United States in his head. He then used that knowledge to create the first integrated textile mill in America in Waltham, Massachusetts, on the banks of the Charles River. He and some of his friends joined together to form a company called the Boston Associates. And the innovation here was that raw cotton came into the first floor of this mill, and by the time it emerged from the upper floors, it was finished cloth. In America, there was textile production before this, but it was done sequentially. It all wasn't done in the same place, and certainly not at the scale that could be done in a single mill like this. Well, people who invested in the Boston Associates enterprise were greatly rewarded by their investment. They received 25% return in dividends in the first couple of years of operation, and they clamored for more. Americans also liked the idea of domestically produced cotton. It was more affordable than that which would be imported from England. And so Francis and his associates hoped to expand. But the Charles River only drops 6 feet, and it doesn't create enough hydropower to provide the energy needed for a larger manufacturing enterprise. Unfortunately, in 1817, Francis Cabot Lowell died at age 44, but his dream of a large-scale manufacturing city did not die with him. It was carried forth to the banks of the Merrimack River, what was then East Chelmsford, by 3 of his associates, Kirk Booth, Nathan Appleton, and Patrick Tracy Jackson. They had all worked together with Francis Cabot Lowell on the Waltham mill. They knew how to operate it, and they carried Francis's dream to the Pawtucket Falls, where the Merrimack River dropped 32 feet in just a mile, and would provide sufficient energy for the type of large-scale cotton manufacturing center they envisioned. Well, Lowell grew very quickly. It got its own town charter in 1826. The first mill had opened as East Chelmsford in 1823. And the city grew rapidly. It got its city charter 10 years later in 1836. And the population exploded. it went from a few hundred people living in the sparsely settled East Chelmsford community to tens of thousands very rapidly. By 1834, Lowell had 22 different cotton mills. They were using 750,000 pounds of cotton every week, and they were turning that into 236 yards of finished cotton cloth every week. As the decades went on, that number only increased. Well, that cotton did come from the American South, and it was picked by enslaved Africans who grew from 2.4 million in the 1830s to nearly 4 million on the eve of the Civil War in 1860. Amos Lawrence, who was one of the mill owners in Lowell, he owned and created the Lawrence Mills, and then he went on to found the city of Lawrence along with his brother. He expressed the feelings many in Lowell had for the cotton industry in a letter he wrote to a friend in South Carolina in 1852. Lawrence wrote, "My connection with the people of your state, growing out of my marriage, has brought me into personal intercourse for more than 30 years past with a great family connection, embracing in its circle many of your distinguished characters." Ralph Waldo Emerson, the famous essayist from Concord, Massachusetts, and also a critic of slavery, wrote in 1846 that it was cotton thread that held the Union together. It unites John C. Calhoun, who was a senator from South Carolina, and Abbott Lawrence, the brother of Amos, who we just met. Emerson went on to say, "Patriotism is for holidays and summer evenings with music and rockets, but cotton thread is the Union." Nathan Appleton, one of the original founders of Lowell, in early 1860, wrote to a friend in Virginia, "All attempts of the North to affect the state of slavery in the South are utterly idle and futile. The idea that there is an irrepressible conflict between the free states and the slave states is absurd and untrue. Mutual interest and mutual goodwill may resume is the sentiment with which I subscribe myself." Well, when the mill owners first came to Lowell and constructed their mills, they also built very early on a church, a congregational church in which they could worship. And that church became St. Anne's Church. Not only the mill owners came here, but many of the young women operatives who worked in the mills worshiped here on Sundays. The longtime pastor of St. Anne's Church, the Reverend Theodore Edson, however, became the president of the Lowell Anti-Slavery Society. Edson, many others, and especially many of the young women who came from farms around New England to work in the Lowell mills, had a strong opposition to slavery. They felt it was morally wrong. And despite the economic benefits they were deriving from slavery, they still felt that it was evil and that they should protest it and speak out against it. The mill girls weren't the only ones speaking out against it. The famous poet John Greenleaf Whittier published an abolitionist newspaper called the Middlesex Standard right here in Lowell. Wendell Phillips and William Lloyd Garrison, who are pictured on the left in this photo, two leading abolitionists in Massachusetts, also came to Lowell often, and on several occasions they brought George Thompson, who was from England, a country that had abolished slavery in the 1820s. Thompson came to speak out against the evils of slavery, and he made several visits to Lowell in October and November of 1834. When he spoke, he used a public room in the upper floors of Lowell City Hall, which is pictured in this drawing, and that's what the building looks like today. It's known as the Old City Hall building, and it's the headquarters of the Enterprise Bank. Well, Thompson drew a huge crowd, both favorable listeners, but also people that disagreed with him. Here's what he wrote afterwards about his visit to Lowell. On Monday evening, the hall was again crowded. After I had spoken for about an hour, there was a disturbance near the door, a great deal of yelling. Soon afterwards, a heavy brick was hurled with tremendous force through a window immediately behind me and passed at the exact level with my head, about half a foot to the right. Frederick Douglass, who was an escaped slave who became one of the leading advocates of abolitionists in the American North, came to Lowell frequently. Like Thompson, he encountered hostility from the many of the mill owners, many of those who worked in the mills, but he always drew a receptive crowd because of the strength of the abolitionist feeling in the city. Another person who came to Lowell was a young congressman from Illinois named Abraham Lincoln. He did not come to speak in favor of abolitionism. Instead, he came in September of 1848 as a surrogate for Zachary Taylor, who was the candidate for president for the Whig Party in that year's election, and Taylor was successful. One of the members of the Whig Party in Massachusetts, Senator Charles Sumner, was not happy with the Taylor nomination. Taylor was a war hero from the Mexican War. He had been a very decorated and successful general. He had no political background, but he did own a number of slaves. Sumner, for that reason, opposed Taylor, and he said the nomination of Zachary Taylor by the Whig Party for the president was, quote, a diabolical alliance between the lords of the lash and the lords of the loom, unquote. But what Sumner meant by that was the Whig Party was a national party, so it had members in the South who were plantation owners who owned slaves. They were the lords of the lash, and also had members of the party in the North, particularly in New England. And they were the mill owners, and they derived much of their revenue from the fruit of the labor of the enslaved African slaves in the South. They were the lords of the loom, as Sumner called them. Well, there were many diplomatic efforts to keep the country from splitting apart over the issue of slavery. One of them came in 1850. It was the Compromise of 1850. It had a number of provisions. California was admitted as a non-slave state. Slavery was abolished in the District of Columbia. The boundaries between Texas and New Mexico were adjusted. There were new territories created from Utah and New Mexico. And most significantly from this story was the Fugitive Slave Act, which was a law that had existed for a while, was strengthened in a way that repulsed many people in the North. Under the Compromise of 1850, it became a legal obligation of anyone who was a free person to assist in the capture and return of an escaped slave to its, quote, owner, unquote. This had an effect in Lowell because Lowell had a small but very vibrant African-American population in 1850. Two families in particular had settled here. One was called the Lew family, the other was the Lewis family. And on the left, we see a portrait of Barzillai Lew, who lived in this area in colonial times. He's pictured in his Continental Army uniform. He served in the Army throughout the Revolutionary War, and he was usually as a musician, but he saw combat throughout the war with the regular Army units. He came back here to Lowell. He's buried in this area, and his progeny have lived in the city for decades thereafter. Similarly, the Lewis family came here in the early 19th century, settled down, and some of them, like Walker Lewis, I think this is Walker Lewis Jr., he actually served in the United States Navy during the Civil War. But some of the people, some of the African Americans in Lowell, and this is a picture of the Lew House, which was a stop on the Underground Railroad. This is what was known as Mechanics Hall. It's on Dutton Street. You can see a little bit of City Hall in the background. And it was called Mechanics Hall because it was a place for the mechanics, the mill operatives to go. They could study, they could learn their trade better, they could socialize there. But it also was a type of an exhibition hall. And at one point, there was an exhibition of something called chemical painting. It was an experimental method of painting. It wasn't photography, which was brand new at the time, but it was something similar to it. And because it was so new and interesting, the students from nearby Lowell High School had a field trip where they walked across Merrimack Street to see the exhibit. But Lowell High School, which was founded in 1831, was the first integrated public high school in America. And so African American students attended school alongside their white counterparts. And because this exhibit was from the South, the proprietor of the exhibit refused to let any African American children come in and see it. Well, the next day, the local newspaper, the Lowell Courier, wrote this editorial. The editorialist wrote, "We very much regret that the proprietor of the chemical paintings refuses to admit our colored citizens. The children of Mr. Lewis have as much right to visit a public exhibition as those of the richest and most influential of our citizens. The proprietor has very much mistaken the public sentiment of Lowell. Let him visit our public schools and he will see children of colored parents sitting side by side with those of white parents, living evidence of toleration and mutual respect." Well, another impact of the Fugitive Slave Act came, and it affected this man, Linus Childs, who was one of the general managers of one of the mills, and a man named Nathaniel Booth, who was an escaped slave who had settled in Lowell and became a barber. And he was very popular and a very well-liked man. Linus Childs actually lived in this building, which is at Kirk Street. It was the mill agent's house. It's now the headquarters of Lowell National Historic Park. Well, what happened was bounty hunters who were on the lookout for escaped slaves came to Lowell in pursuit of Nathaniel Booth. He had heard that they were coming and he escaped and he went to Montreal to hide out where he was safe. This is in October of 1850. This is another newspaper of Lowell, the Lowell Tri-Weekly American. It wrote under a story titled "Man Stealers in Lowell." "We understand that one or more persons were in this city yesterday for the purpose of capturing Mr. Booth, the barber, a very respectable man. We hope Mr. Booth will return to the city, for we think there are men enough in Lowell who believe in the higher law to protect him against all the efforts of the man stealers." This story ended well for Nathaniel Booth because Linus Childs took up a collection among his friends and raised enough money to pay the supposed owner of Nathaniel Booth his purchase price, and he won Booth his freedom, and he was able to come back to Lowell safely. I think this Linus Childs story is particularly interesting because here's one of the general managers of one of the mills, and the whole mill enterprise was based on the use of cotton picked by slaves. Yet here's Linus Childs interceding on behalf of an escaped slave. Well, the Compromise of 1850 really didn't solve anything, and so 4 years later, Congress adopted the KansasNebraska Act, and that voided the Missouri Compromise, which from 1820 had kept the Union together, and it imposed what was called popular sovereignty in new territories. Under the Missouri Compromise, that states that were north of a certain line would be free, and those south would have slavery. But popular sovereignty said, as new territories become created, that the residents can vote for themselves whether they should be slave or free. Now, the famous Civil War historian James Macpherson, in his book Battle Cry of Freedom, said that this law, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, quote, "may have been the most important single event pushing the nation towards civil war, unquote. Amos Lawrence, who we saw earlier talking about his strong ties to South Carolina, was deeply affected by this law. In a letter he wrote, he said, "Such a revolution of sentiment never took place before. We went to bed one night old-fashioned, conservative, compromise Union Whigs, and woke up stark mad abolitionists." Well, there are many consequences to the Kansas-Nebraska Act. People in New England who opposed slavery helped finance anti-slavery settlers moving to Kansas. Amos Lawrence was one of them that financed them. That's why the city of Lawrence, Kansas has its name. It's named for him. He created the New England Immigrant Aid Society. In May of 1856, a group of pro-slavery people from Missouri raided a city of Lawrence, Kansas, and they basically destroyed the city and tried to drive out people. In retaliation for that, a man named Jon Brown, some of his sons and supporters, went to the small Kansas town of Pottawatomie, which was a center of pro-slavery sentiments, and they massacred a number of homeowners there in retaliation for what was done in Lawrence, Kansas. And this was just another episode that really raised the temperature of the United States to the boiling point. Another incident that happened just days after these events in Kansas occurred in the United States Senate. Charles Sumner, who we've spoken before, gave a speech in which he condemned Southerners that supported slavery. He so outraged a congressman from South Carolina named Preston Brooks that Brooks stormed onto the floor of the Senate and attacked Sumner, beating him with his cane until Sumner was near death and unconscious, and until Brooks's cane broke. Well, Congress expelled Brooks for this violent act, but the people of his district immediately reelected him, and he returned to Congress, only missing a couple of weeks' service. In addition to that, hundreds of people from across the South sent him brand new canes to replace the one that he had broken over Sumner's head. And then just a few years after this, Jon Brown, who we've heard of in Kansas, emerged in Virginia. And he led a raid on the federal arsenal, a place where rifles were built and stored at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. And his objective was to lead a slave rebellion from across the South, and he wanted the rifles to arm the slaves who were in revolt. Well, the United States Army put down this revolt, and Brown was hanged shortly after this, and he was seen in the North as a martyr, and in the South he was seen as a dangerous person who was a threat to their way of life and their safety. And that's where we stood in November of 1860, and with the election of the presidential election of 1860. The Whig Party had disintegrated. In the prior election, 1856, a new party, the Republican Party, had emerged and had its first nominee for president, although a man named John Fremont, was unsuccessful. 1860, however, the Republicans nominated Abraham Lincoln. The Democratic Party split into a northern and a southern wing. The Northerners nominated Stephen Douglas, a senator from Illinois, and the Southern wing nominated John Breckinridge, a former senator who then served as vice president under President Buchanan. There was actually a third or fourth party called the Constitutional Union Party, and it nominated a man named John Bell, who was very much in favor of slavery, but he was also in favor of saving the Union. Well, in the election, Lincoln was elected. He won every state in the North except New Jersey, but he didn't receive a single electoral vote from the South. As a response to Lincoln's election, the state of South Carolina seceded from the Union in December of 1860, and in January, before Lincoln was inaugurated, the states of Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas followed South Carolina out of the Union. And that's where we stood as the presidency of James Buchanan wound down. In 1861, the new president didn't take office until early March. And that's where this episode, The Lords of the Loom, will end. Please join us for a future episode about the start of the Civil War in April of 1861. I'm Richard Howe. Thanks for joining me for this episode of Civil War Lowell.